welcome to the show, Sue Holderness. How's it going, Sue?
Otherwise known as Marlene, of course. Everything's good here. Thank you very much, Chris. It's very nice to talk to you.
Everything's cushy, yeah?
Everything's cushy, just as it should be. I ain't got Boise here at the moment, but, you know, he's looking after the dog, so that's all right.
So the first episode you appeared in Only Fools and Horses was Sleeping Dogs Lie in 1985. What are your memories of that?
Well, I just remember it being a really lovely day, and I honestly didn't expect it to be more than that. It was a great surprise, the whole business. I mean, normally when you in this game, when you get a job, you have to meet the director or the producer, and you sometimes have to do an audition and talk about it. But none of that happened with this. My agent suddenly rang up and said, "Do you fancy doing one day's filming on Only Fools and Horses?" And of course, I knew the show. 3 series had gone out. I'd seen quite a lot of episodes. But I didn't know a great deal about Marlene, and I knew that whenever anybody said, "Oi, do you remember Marlene?" the reply was always, "All the boys remember Marlene." So I knew she was a bit of a tarty number, and I'd been playing sort of rather posh birds up until then, at that particular point of my career. So it was a great surprise just to be offered it, and of course a great thrill, because when the script arrived, it was a John Sullivan gem. I mean, they're all gems, but he had written this little scene, which was my only scene, was just a wonderful scene. And as soon as I read it, I knew Marlene. I knew her inside out. I just knew who she was. So I looked forward greatly to doing it. I was very nervous about it because I was a bit overawed. I'd been watching them all on the telly, and I didn't know the actors. I didn't know David Nicholas or John, who of course played Del, Rodney, and Boise. So I was a bit nervous on the first day. All first days are frightening, aren't they? And then I discovered that without any sort of preamble and no chat with David, we went straight into the scene because they were running a bit behind. Suddenly I found myself being snogged and having my bottom pinched. And I thought, this is good fun. I like this job.
And this was the episode with Duke, your lovable dog, and this is where Del Boy and Rodley look after him.
Well, that was the only reason I was there, of course. John Sullivan had the idea for this storyline where Del and Rodney would look after a big dog, and they couldn't think where the big dog would come from. And I learned later that they had always planned for Marlene to be a sort of an indoors character, because at the time, Minder was very popular, and George Cole's wife was an indoors character, and you never saw her. And I think that's what they thought. You know, Marlene had just an amazing reputation for being this girl who'd been about a bit. I think they thought it was better not to see her. But suddenly John thought, I suppose we could see her for a moment. Boise could give Marlene a dog and then take her on holiday, and then we can use the dog storyline. The boys will look after the dog. So I was really only there to introduce the dog. But I was lucky because it was such a smashing funny scene that in a couple of weeks, John Sullivan said he'd seen the rushes and he liked what I'd done with Marlene, and he decided that she would be back. So I became a pretty regular member of the show from then on, thank God.
Yeah, that was my next question, actually. When you were first cast, did you know you would be returning as the role of Marlene?
Absolutely no idea. And I honestly didn't expect it. After the day's filming, and it wasn't even a whole day, I was home just after lunch. And I just remember thinking, what a smashing day. Pity it's only one day's work, but what a lovely day it was. So it was just unbelievable when John rang me at home and said that this character, Marlene voice, would be coming back into the show. And I mean, I couldn't think of anything more exciting. But I mean, I thought it might be 1 episode or 2 episodes. The fact that she became a regular feature was just thrilling. And you know, at that stage, none of us could possibly have guessed what this show was going to become. You know, that I meet people almost every day who are fans of the show, and they're all ages. You know, 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, 12-year-olds, 15-year-olds, grannies, grandpas come up and say how much they love the show. And that's now. The last one went out in 2003. So, you know, 14 years after the last one even went out, people are still discovering it and loving it.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing with Fools and Horses, isn't it? It's for every generation.
It's extraordinary. You know, there are kids out there now who they've got the equivalent of a computer on a watch on their wrists, and when they watch these shows, the mobile phones that Del Boy uses are the size of bricks. So, you know, they're period pieces, and yet kids do seem to find that they're still relevant to what they're going through today. Because, you know, John Sullivan, he was, I say it again, and without hesitation, I think, a genius. He wrote about people, and his stories are timeless.
And what was it like reading a script by John Sullivan, the late John Sullivan, when you first got it in the post?
It was just a thrill, and I had a sort of routine, a ritual, whatever time of day it arrived. I would make a cup of coffee, wouldn't open it until I made a cup of coffee and taken it up to my bedroom. I'd get back into bed with it. It was a little treat, and I'd just lie there and chortle. It was extraordinary, because each new script that came in, you thought they can't be as funny as the last one, and they got funnier because as John got to know the cast, the people that he had cast in these roles, he started to write for us. So you could hear exactly what Roger Lloyd Pack was going to do with Trigger, and what Dale and Rodney were going to do with their lines, and Boycie and his laugh, and Marlene and her terrible, her Cockney, little stuff that she had. He wrote sort of for us. So you could, when you read it on the page, you could hear what was going to happen, and then the rehearsals were just a thrill. Watching it come to life was, because I've never known a writer as clever at making you laugh and making you cry.
Yeah, I actually met you years ago at one of these shows, these Only Fools and Horses shows, and that was the picture that I tweeted on my Twitter page, and I was about 13 then, and now I'm 31, so just goes to show, doesn't it?
You followed us for a large chunk of your life. Well, of course, my children, when I did my first episode, I was in fact 3 months pregnant with my first child, so my kids have grown up knowing me as Marlene. Everywhere we go, all their lives, they've had, in fact, when they were little, I think they sort of thought that everybody their job was being on the television. And when we went into the butcher's, they said, when's he going to be on? They also thought everybody did something on the television until they got a bit more grown up and realised it was a bit exceptional to have a mother who was on this show that everybody talked about and everybody laughed. And I will be grateful to my dying day that I was the one they chose to play Marlene, because I'd have gone on playing Marlene until I was in my Zimmer frame. I'd like to have played her to the bitter end. It's so tragic that we lost our wonderful writer.
Yeah, very sad, and also lost to Roger Lloyd Pack. That was also very sad and very sudden, wasn't it?
Before his time, we lost Grandad, and I mean that was a very good example of John Sullivan and his brilliance, because he'd written the whole of series for Grandad, and the shock. When he fell ill and Grandad died, Leonard Pierce, who played Grandad, died. The whole cast went into a sort of mourning, because John Sullivan and his family really thought of Leonard Pierce as another grandfather. The kids called him Grandad. They'd get presents from their two grandfathers at Christmas and from Grandad in the show.
That's
so
nice.
It was a terrible shock for everybody when he died. And there was a moment, I know, when Sullivan thought maybe we just shouldn't do any more. But then everybody said, Leonard Pierce would hate it if the show stopped. So he was brave enough to write a funeral scene. He said, this is family. They would see off Grandad properly. They'd want him to be laid to rest properly. And we must see that. And of course, that episode was amazingly sad. But in it were also some of the funniest jokes. The very moving moment when they find Grandad's hat and Rodney strokes it and then drops it on top of the coffin. And later in the scene, the vicar goes around saying, "Has anybody seen my hat?" And you realise they've buried the wrong hat. I mean, it's just genius. It's just genius, because it's tender. There's nothing cruel ever about it. It's tender and touching, and it makes, of course, it makes you laugh, but more often than I think any situation comedy writer, he also can make you cry.
Yeah, there's many moments like that, and I think the documentary I was watching on UK TV Gold, Nicholas Lyndhurst was saying that the day before, or a couple of days before, he actually went to Leonard Pierce's real funeral, didn't they? They
all did, yes, and so the emotion in the filming of the funeral is absolutely raw and real, because it was terribly sad for everybody. They were, real tears throughout the whole auditorium. Well, not the auditorium, the church. You can see I come from the theatre. But it wasn't difficult for the people to look as though they genuinely were desperately sad to have lost a family member, because they were. It was awful. But I think so clever of him. But then you see, John Sullivan, who we know wrote comedy, he was never frightened to touch on subjects that were very dark. The whole storyline of Boycie and Marlene not being able to have a baby touched people's hearts. Cassandra having her miscarriage. He was brave in his writing. He wrote about real life tragic events that happen, and I'm sure that's why it goes on being popular, because he wanted every member of his family to be able to sit down and watch the shows together, all age groups. So they don't drink and drive, they don't swear, they don't take drugs, they are big-hearted people. I know that their dodgy business dealings are, a bit, but they're not half as dodgy as some of the stuff that goes on with bankers and our politicians, are they?
They're just trying to get by, aren't they, really?
They're just trying to get by, as are most of us. And they've got big hearts. Del and Rodney, they care for old people, they're kind to young people. And I think because it's got such heart, that's why it goes on being as popular as it is, because you can watch it with every member of the family.
Yeah, and I think one of those tender moments was when Rodney's stuck in the elevator with Del Boy, and that's after Cassandra's miscarriage. I mean, that's such a great scene, because he stops the lift, doesn't he, so that Rodney can get it all out. And
so clever, because Rodney couldn't talk about it. It was too painful. He couldn't talk about it. So Del Boy had to find a way, and, he faked the lift breaking down so that he could just quietly let him get it all out. And it's a terribly touching scene. I was involved as well in two, I think, very moving scenes. One was when we nearly adopted a baby. I'm not sure you'll be able to do that anymore.
Oh, I watched that one very recently, actually.
Yeah, and it was lovely. And
very
Marlene
funny, the conclusion.
More than anything in life, Marlene wanted a baby, and eventually, and Del suddenly, he finds that there's this German girl who doesn't want the baby that she's carrying, and thinks he can flog it to Boycie, and then of course we find out that the baby's brown, and Boycie has this wonderful speech, which brought the house down, saying, I might be able to con people into buying my cars, I might be able to convince them you've conceived and gave birth in 7 days flat, but how the hell am I going to convince them that my granddad was Louis Armstrong? It absolutely brought the house down. And then you see David Jason's genius, where straight after that, he very tenderly says to Marlene, it makes sense. And you could feel, you could hear a pin drop, and Marlene has to leave this baby that she's longed for. And as I walked out the door, people were crying in the audience, having just had this huge laugh. It's just brilliant writing.
Yeah, and we were happy for her that she eventually got her kid, didn't she?
Yeah, she eventually got her longed-for baby. Lovely for Marlene. The question mark remains. But anyway, we won't go into that. And and then Del was so naughty, wasn't he? And then I take the baby photograph down to show them all in the pub, and he says, "Oh look, that you see, that's Mike's nose there, and look, that's Rodney's ears," and it's suggesting that maybe the fathering was not necessarily Boycie.
I also remember the bit when you say to your son, "Go and wave to Daddy," and they all wave back, don't they?
They all wave. He's so clever, Sullivan, isn't he? And it was just such a joy to be in. And when they finally got their millions, with that terribly clever storyline, which we were all told to keep quiet about, the press guessed that it was going to be that they'd win the lottery. They knew they were going to win the millions. That had got out, but they thought it was going to win the lottery. So we were all told to keep very quiet. And he found this brilliant storyline about a real live historical watch, John Harrison watch, that had solved the problem of longitude at sea, and it's been missing for 300 years. And nobody could possibly have guessed that storyline. And then when they eventually took the watch to Sotheby's and they got 6.2 million, the nation rejoiced. We were all so pleased that at last this chap who strives, works his socks off to try and make money, never manages to, but is still optimistic. Whatever things are going wrong, he says, this time next year we'll be millionaires. And suddenly they were. And when we shot the episode in the studio, everybody was crying and cheering and standing up. But they were also crying because we were sure it meant that it was the end. And then, of course, 5 years later, the BBC said, the public is crying out for Christmas specials. So they got us together in 2001, and we did, which was lovely. It was really lovely to get back together again, having been away for 5 years. And we did 3 long episodes that went out over the next 3 consecutive Christmases, which meant that although we all finished in 2001, the punters still got a new episode every Christmas until 2003.
Yeah, and we were very happy you came back. With time on our hands, just over 24 million people tuned in for that episode in 1996. I mean,
yes, I mean you simply wouldn't get audiences
that's
like
the record,
that,
isn't it? Yeah.
Yes, amazing. And there were some people who said, "Don't bring it back. Let's leave them there, walking into the sunset, saying this time next year we'll be billionaires." But it was perfectly logical that Del, with his dodgy dealings, could easily lose the money, which he did, and sort of more satisfying to get them back into Nelson Mandela House, where he was more comfortable. You could see he wasn't really happy in his big mansion with his billiard table and his luxury pool and everything. He needed to be back, or down the market and back in his Nelson Mandela home.
Yeah, I think he enjoyed socialising with people, didn't he? And when he got all the money, you've got a different life, haven't you?
Yes, and it didn't suit him. It didn't suit any of them. They needed to be back, in the heart of that wonderful Peckham community, where everybody's striving to get by, and there's this love and camaraderie that he didn't have when he got all the dosh. It wasn't the same. And you hear that about people who win the lottery, don't you? Having had perfectly happy lives, they're struggling, working hard. Suddenly they win 14 million. Spend it all and are miserable. You're jumping out of your comfort zone, aren't you? And so it was lovely. I think it was quite right that they did those 3 episodes, and you saw them back where they should be.
Yeah,
in the life they understood and loved.
Yeah, and you got some great more comedy moments from Only Fools and Horses, didn't you? So what's not to like?
What's not to like? And the tragedy is that we lost John Sullivan, who was only 64, and in 2011, the shock when he got viral pneumonia, we couldn't believe that we'd actually lost him. And the tragedy is that he said he could go on writing Only Fools and Horses forever. He had stories that he could have come up, he need never have stopped. And so he wrote lots of other things, of course. Citizen Smith, I was in Dear John. He was very loyal. He put me into Dear John, playing the wife of John's best friend, where I got 5 kids. He never worked with animals or children, and John always wrote scenes for me with animals or children. But he wrote a lot of other stuff. He was prolific. There aren't that many episodes, considering how long we did it, of Only Fools. I think it's only 64. But they're all perfect little gems, aren't they?
Yeah, fantastic. You can't beat Only Fools and Horses, in my book, anyway.
No, you can't.
So this is a very hard question, your final question on the show. What is your favourite moment as Marlene? Oh, that's a hard question.
It's a terribly hard question because there's so many of them. But, of course, the favourite moment for me was when in 2002, John Sullivan asked John Tallis and me to go down to see him in Brighton. We were on tour, in fact, then. And he said that he'd had an idea for a spin-off series for Boycie and Marlene. And so my favourite moment was when he said, how do you fancy the idea of a spin-off series starring Boycie and Marlene? And the work began on what was to become the Green, Green Grass, which is not as good as Only Fools and Horses. It's very different. But it meant that we could play with those characters for another 4 years. And we had such a lovely time doing it. And, of course, I did more Green, Green Grass than Only Fools. So my favourite moment, really, I suppose, was the day when, right at the beginning, they said, how do you fancy one day's work on Only Fools and Horses? And it became, what is it now, 30-something years? And most of the work that I get now is because of Marlene, and I remain hugely grateful to John Sullivan and very proud of both shows.
Well, it's been lovely to talk to you, Sue, and thanks for the memories.
Thank you very much for ringing, and you never know, this time next year we may all be millionaires.
Yeah, you never know, that would be nice, wouldn't it?
Fingers crossed.
Lovely jubbly. Okay, thanks a lot, Sue. Lovely to talk to you.